British are coming, the British are coming.
Now the ride of Paul Revere set the nation on its ear, and the shot at Lexington heard round the world. When the British fired in the early dawn, the War of Independence had begun. The die was cast, the rebel flag unfurled, and on to Concord marched the foe to seize the arsenal there, you know, waking folks, searching all around, till our militia stopped them in their tracks. At the old North Bridge we turned them back and chased those redcoats back to Boston town. And the shot heard around the world was the start of the revolution.
I welcome this kind of examination.
I am paying for this microphone.
What difference does it make?
I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore.
I'm just a patsy.
Not a Pax Americana, enforced on the world by American weapons of war.
Wherever there's a cop beating up a guy, I'll be there.
We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. The rock was landed on us.
The United States is owned by foreign corporations. Do you really care? And if anybody cares, they're considered crazy.
I have sinned against you, my Lord.
Man, all the humanity and all the...
Controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
An unspeakable tragedy. Dead on arrival.
And I will go to my grave being at peace about it.
Our long national nightmare is over. Don't give up. Don't ever give up.
This is the Midnight Writer News Show with S.T. Patrick.
Hello, this is Nicholas Hallis. You're listening to the Midnight Writer News Show with S.T. Patrick.
Hello, America and the world. Welcome to the Midnight Writer News Show. I'm S.T. Patrick, your friendly neighborhood host, traipsing through the trials and travails that have so tempestuously and untruthfully been blasted into your eyes, ears, and minds by the state-sponsored talking heads, the court historians, and the textbook conglomerates that control information today. Tonight, we have episode 076, Founding Myths with Ray Raphael. Our guest tonight is author Ray Raphael, who'll join us next in the Midnight Hour. First, a little cleaning of the castle. We would like to remind everyone that we are available on a number of outlets. Now, I think the easiest way to find us with an iPhone is to open up Apple's simple-to-use podcast app and just search for us there. Search for Midnight Writer News. Now, we're also on iTunes if you prefer that and have an iPhone, or if you have iTunes on your phone. But for an Android, laptop, or other mobile device, you can go to midnightwriternews.com, or you can catch us on many podcast providers such as Stitcher Radio or Podcast Addict, Player FM, and there's a whole lot of them out there. So just do a search for Midnight Writer News or the Midnight Writer News Show, and you should be able to find us at your chosen location. We also have a donation button on the site, so if you can help us, we thank you. We really do appreciate each and every one of you, and anything that you can donate to the work of truth is helpful. So we'll be right back with Ray Raphael.
Hi, this is Clara Bingham, author of Witness to the Revolution. For more on the radicals, resistors, vets, and hippies that awakened America in the year that it lost its mind and found its soul, listen to episode 41 of the Midnight Writer News Show.
I hope everyone had a wonderful day today. You may hear fireworks in the background. It is July 4th, which is Independence Day in America, and what a perfect day to talk to Ray Raphael, the author of Founding Myths. A contemporary of Professor Howard Zinn, Ray teaches and writes about history through the movements of common people. His People's History of the American Revolution in 2001 was widely acclaimed, but my favorite work is his 2004 book, Founding Myths, Stories That Hide Our Patriotic Past. I used this work as an inspiration in my own teaching career, and it's still one worth owning today. So if you don't have it, go out there and get it. You will not be sorry. Now, it's Founding Myths that will be our focus tonight, but I'd also encourage everyone to look at the rest of Ray's catalog, as he has some very intriguing work on the Constitution as well. So when I get to interview someone whose work I used in the classroom, it is a real honor. That said, allow me to introduce the great Ray Raphael to the program. Ray, how are you this evening?
I'm doing well, and I'm pleased to be talking with you.
Well, we're certainly pleased to have you, and it's always nice to talk to someone whose work you own and have enjoyed for so long as I have yours. But it's also nice to talk to someone whose website, rayraphael.com, has teaching tools on it. Very nice. So, Ray, how did you get interested in a career path where you would explore this unconventional alternate side to history?
Well, I'm going to have to backtrack actually more than half a century. in my own life to the 1960s. I was very active in the civil rights and peace movements in the 60s. And I went down, for instance, to the South. I'm from the North. I went to the South in the summers of 62 and 64 for Freedom Summer in Mississippi. And I got a first-hand look about how history is actually made. I mean, I participated in this amazing grassroots movement. And when in Mississippi, I had the good fortune to meet and spend a little time with some of these Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee field secretaries, Stokely Carmichael and Charlie Cobb, just a brief 2 days with them, and with Fannie Lou Hamer and Amzie Moore from rural Mississippi. These were locals who had been actually active in promoting civil rights in rural Mississippi for a couple of decades. And they were the most amazing people, and the organization was so amazing, and this is a dramatic grassroots movement. By the way, Fannie Lou Hamer, you might know, she became famous just about 3 months after I met her. She was the one at the 1968 Democratic National Convention, came up for the Mississippi Freedom Delegation and said, "I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired." Anyway, she was just, and she wasn't before that. She was just, I just spent a night at her house. She was just this amazing woman, and that's what the civil rights movement was made from. The dough, which from which was fashioned this amazing movement was ordinary people. So, as years later, I'm teaching history, and I always have that kind of feeling that, social movements and ordinary people are really where it's at if you want to get down to the nitty-gritty. And so I was actually preparing some curriculum work for teaching history in the high school level, secondary level. And I started with the American Revolution, and I started researching common people in the Revolution. And this is 25 years ago. And as they say, once you're in the late 18th century America, once you're there, you never fully return. So I've actually lived for the last 25 years, half in the current times and half back there. And so I wrote this book called The People's History of the American Revolution. I researched all kinds of common people. There was a lot of academic research done there, but it wasn't really kind of collected and put out to a general public. So as I was researching, I came across this references to crowd actions and discontent in rural Massachusetts before the Revolution. So I kind of looked those up, and it was far from just crowd actions and discontent. This was an actual revolution staged in Massachusetts the year before Lexington and Concord. In 1774, all of Massachusetts outside of Boston, that's 95% of the people, had totally thrown off British rule, never to return. And it was just amazed me that this story of the revolution before the revolution was not included in any of the textbooks. So that kind of alerted me to something that said, wait a second, who's the gatekeeper here? How do we determine what stories we tell and what stories we don't tell? So I just kind of really just off the top of my head started looking at a lot of the common stories about the Revolution, Paul Revere and Valley Forge and Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death, these sorts of things. And one by one, as I researched them, I found out that Holy Toledo, these are fabricated tales based on folklore and kind of emerged in the 19th century, mostly in the early 19th century, to serve nationalistic and kind of narrative demands of romanticizing the revolution. And so that's what got me into really the story behind the story is how we tell the story. And that's what I've been involved with really for the last 2 decades is how we tell the story.
Exactly, and it's a wise perspective to take on the field of historical education because there really are 2 equal parts to teaching history. There's what you teach, and then there's how you teach it. And what I like about your work is that it veers from the accepted sort of proper noun norms of history education. And one of the first stories you clarify in Founding Myths is one that I've loved since my childhood, I'll admit it, The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. And as I grew older, though, and as I started to teach especially, I always thought that Revere should be best known for his propagandist engraving of the so-called Boston Massacre. But you really delve into what those midnight rides were all about and who was involved. So what is the truth behind Paul Revere and the Midnight Ride?
Listen, my children, and you shall hear the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere.
Exactly.
Yeah, and of course that's a Longfellow's poem done just before the Civil War, basically to rouse nationalistic sentiment. And the real story is, for one thing, I'm going to actually backtrack on the real story to what I mentioned earlier. That was 1775. And in 1774, the year before that, the entire Massachusetts colony outside of Boston overthrew British rule. And so that was in September and October of 74. During the remaining 6 months between there and the midnight ride of Paul Revere, the people of Massachusetts were totally organizing and getting everything ready. They knew the British were going to come fight back. They weren't going to just relinquish a colony. They were going to, do something to try to take it over again. And so they started stockpiling weapons to defend themselves. And they had two major places: Worcester in the interior, about 40 miles west of Boston, and Concord, which was much closer. And everybody knew that when the British wanted to, basically try to take back the colony, they were going to go after one of these stockpiles. And so Worcester was too far away, and they reasoned, as the British did, that Concord would be the only likely target. So they set up this elaborate warning system, and Paul Revere was very active in this warning system. He 2 weeks before Lexington and Concord, he rode out and warned Concord there was a false alarm, they were attacking. Well, they weren't attacking yet. Then 2 days before the ride, he rides out again and works out all the intricacies and the subtle things about the communication system to alert them exactly when they're going to come. And the system they set up, it involves absolutely everybody. There's other riders. They're going to be riding on the midnight ride of Paul Revere. He's going to ride out, and then all other riders are going to ride out from where they, when they hear the word, and they have church bells and gunshots. And David Hackett Fisher in the 1990s put this together in a great book called Paul Revere's Ride, and he catalogs individually and collectively all the individuals and groups that were involved in spreading the alarm that night. And so it was hardly this kind of like surprise. People have been geared up for this for 6 months. They've been training. They've been fine-tuning the communication system. And this is kind of like how history works. There's this grand social movement collectively, and it gets reduced to this heroic single person, just a man riding his horse. That's all it takes to start the revolution.
Why is that, Ray? Why do we do that with history?
It really, there's this demand for narrative, and narratives demand protagonists. And so we single out these single heroes, and then we convince ourselves that they are the ones that made it all happen. And obviously, individuals make things happen, but they make things happen in context. And more often than not, the context is lost in the telling of the story about individuals.
I find as well that we tend to take the ideals of the day and then we put them on the backs of those in our history like it's their obligation to atone for all the sins of the fathers as well as fulfilling the hopes and dreams that we have today. And we put these ideals on their backs and we make them carry the load for who we want to be now or what we want to feel now. But if we keep putting our own contemporary attitudes on the backs of historical narratives that have been altered by every generation through our own history, then do we not have to wonder what our ideals even mean?
Right. You've expressed it beautifully, putting them down the backs of our these solo actors. Yes. But that's why my work, which is basically to identify the story making process, I think is critical, because we have to alert ourselves. We have to become conscious of how these stories were created then and how they're created now. And for instance, right now, in the era of, quote, fake news, now more than ever, we have to really look at the process of storytelling as well as the stories themselves.
That's music to my ears, Ray, like a Springsteen song on a lonely highway. But now I want to go into the document of the day, the Declaration of Independence. Today, after all, is July 4th. Now, we're taught that Jefferson writes this alone, a sort of, say, genius by candlelight, but it's really a conglomeration of previously held political beliefs, and it's not solely a statement on Jefferson's brilliance, is it?
No, actually, and let's backtrack a little bit and see where to the time that he was writing that. Let's actually go 21 months before Jefferson's the July 4th, 1776, the date we celebrate for the independence. 21 months before. So now we're back in October 4th, 1774, in the town of Worcester. And the town meeting of Worcester instructs their delegate to the forthcoming provincial congress to basically push for a new and independent form of government, a new form of government that has dependent exclusively on the suffrage of the people. In other words, no crown. And this is the first actual kind of public body with expressing an interest in independence. That was 21 months earlier. Now we're going to go ahead until the 3 months before the Declaration of Independence. Historian Pauline Mayer has identified 90 state and local declarations of independence by well, they weren't states then, colonial, provincial, and local bodies, some of them civil, formal bodies, some of them kind of like the Mechanics Union of New York, basically pushing for independence. There was, again, a huge popular push for independence, and 90 documents that were actually kind of stating why they wanted to do this. Like in that famous preamble of the Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident. As Jefferson wrote those words, he was looking in the Pennsylvania Gazette at a document that George Mason had prepared in preparation for Virginia's new Constitution. And in my Founding Myths book, you can compare the two side by side. Every word and thought that is in Jefferson's is in Mason's, but Jefferson's is just more, it's kind of a rewrite, a more succinct rewrite of Mason's preamble.
We had James Perloff on the show recently, and he discussed a theory that's out there that Jefferson borrowed liberally from Thomas Paine. Now, there are apparently those who have studied the words and the phrasing and the style, and they see Paine. Have you heard this before?
Well, I wouldn't. When we talk about those kind of influences, I'm always I think that's a little simplistic. I don't think Jefferson was the kind of guy who would just sit down and read common sense backwards, and then, what we lose in the telling, then we just kind of reduce one person's individual tale to an earlier person's individual tale. What we're talking about here is a public conversation. There had been a public conversation for 6 months. When very much in the works, people writing letters to each other, these 90 earlier declarations, Thomas Paine's work, all this stuff, and people are talking about it. They're talking about it in taverns. Jefferson's writing to friends about it. It's in the air. And he has this wonderful letter at the late of his life. He says, I didn't write anything new. That wasn't my job or original. I was just trying to sum up the American mind. That's his term, the American mind. This is a year before he dies, he writes this. And that's exactly what he did. He did a great job of kind of summing up the American mind. And then that was the draft. And then, of course, Congress got together and they deleted a whole bunch of it, including that long section condemning slavery and blaming it all on the British, of course. Oh, it's just those British. It's not us slave owners, just those British did it all to it. Anyway, but so again, it was a national conversation and a very a very dramatic and supreme one, and a very monumental one in terms of its consequence. And Jefferson was kind of the last person to put his signature on that, and then we say that he created the whole damn thing.
We do, yes, and we've long viewed the starting point of this war, the opening salvo, as the shot heard round the world, the Battle of Lexington and Concord. But you've already gone into the events that were happening well before Lexington and Concord, but I really think it's a statement, again, on the teaching of history, which is sort of our overarching theme tonight. And I think we like these starting points and turning points and final surrenders because they are easier to teach. It's timeline history, though. You can point to exact moments, but sometimes, as you write about so well, there are movements that surpass the moments, and the shot heard around the world was not really the beginning of the American Revolution.
No, but what it did start with the actual military conflict where two armies are going to fight, are going to line up against each other. That's what it started. It did not start the American Revolution. I already talked about how the people of Massachusetts had already revolted and basically, and kind of said, "Hey, we're done. We're done with you." And there was a huge movement in Massachusetts for independence at that time. In 1774, they said, let's attack the British soldiers in Boston and let's declare our independence. But actually, Samuel Adams and John Adams, they're in Continental Congress, and they write home to their friends, "Oh, you got to slow that revolution in Massachusetts down. The other colonies aren't ready." So this, the flame-throwing Samuel Adams, which is another myth, how he's rabble-rousing. He's the moderate. He's like the Democratic National Committee as opposed to the progressives at this point. And the progressives are out there in the hinterlands, and he's the DNCC, trying to slow those guys down. Like, no, they're not ready yet. So, yeah, there was a whole revolution going on beforehand, but this raises the question: why don't we celebrate that? Well, several reasons. One, if it bleeds, it leads. No, that's it. There was no loss of life. The reason there wasn't any loss of life is because basically 95% of the people were behind it, and anybody who dared resist it would not dare resist it. And so there's no resistance until the British Army actually creates, the conflict. Another is there's no leaders, and it's purposely no leaders. These guys were so democratic. Everything was done, when they got together to overthrow the courts, to dismantle the court system. They get together, like in Worcester, 4,622 people from 37 militia companies are gathering together, and they say, okay, well, how are we going to do this? So they send representatives to the judges inside, and for the judges to prepare their recantation, and they send it back to the people. The people say, no, it's not good enough. So they're meeting in their 37 companies. We don't know who the militia commanders of every 37 companies are. We don't, it was just so broadly based, that kind of movement. So there's no individual. There's no bloodshed, and it's kind of like there's no narrative because it's happening everywhere. It's ubiquitous. So we can't say it started here, and then the army moved to here, and then there was the next battle, and then there's the next battle. So the truest revolution is kind of the revolution that defies storytelling because it is everywhere, and that's what we did. That people in Massachusetts did, and what Lexington and Concord did. Its historical significance is precisely that Samuel Adams and John Adams and the moderates prevailed, and they kept the radicals from attacking too early. They say if you go on the offense, the other colonies aren't going to help you, but if you stay on the defense, they will. So the historical significance of Lexington and Concord is the British marched out. The British marched out, and that's why there's always this conflict about who fired the first shot. But basically, the British marched out into the hinterlands, and so the other colonies said, "Okay, now that they're attacking, now we're going to back you because we can't let that happen." So it was, and this is actually a comment about the nature of revolutions that I think is very important for today, as progressives and less progressives kind of fight over what to do now. Unless the radicals and the moderates who are kind of behind the ultimate end get together and form an alliance, you're not going to have unanimity. You're not going to have that kind of overpowering force that they had in the American Revolution.
I agree with that. I do. And what we've discussed so far are stories that are at least based in truth. But I was wondering if there were any stories that are just flat out untrue. Now, all of these serve a purpose, but the one that comes to mind, for me at least, is one that we're taught in elementary school. That's the story of George Washington chopping down the cherry tree. He goes to his father and he admits his deed by saying, "Father, I cannot tell a lie." Now, this is supposed to show us how moral Washington has always been. So are there any others?
Well, you know what? When I wrote, after Founding Myths, about a decade later, I wrote this book called Constitutional Myths. And the way I structured constitutional myths is every myth has some kernel of truth. I mean, it didn't come from absolutely nowhere. that kernel of truth, though, can be quite, significantly different from what evolves. And so I'll give you a couple of examples. Let's do Patrick Henry's "Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death." Well, we don't know what Patrick Henry said. That comes from William Wirt's biography, and William Wirt, and this was written like 42 years afterwards. And wait, I just have right here. William Wirt is he's getting ready. He wants to write a biography of Patrick Henry, who was a very dramatic person and figure, and very consequential one. But he writes to a friend as he's getting ready to write it, to do his book. He says, "It was all speaking, speaking, speaking. 'Tis true how Henry could talk. God, how he could talk. But from 1763 to 1789, not one of his speeches lives in print, writing, or memory. All that is told me is that on such and such an occasion he made a distinguished speech. There are some ugly traits in Henry's character, and some pretty nearly as ugly blanks. He was a blank military commander, a blank governor, and a blank politician, in all those useful points which depend on composition and detail. In short, it is, verily, as hopeless a subject as man could well desire." So that's what he had to work with. So what did William Wirt do? He invented stuff. I mean, what else is he going to do? And so he gets this guy, who's, now remember, we're 40 years, 4 decades after. He finds this guy who's apt to talk, and then the guy says, well, let's see, okay, I'll try to remember. So 40 years after, this guy who was there, Henry's been dead for like 15 years now. This guy who was there says, well, this is what I thought he said. So he writes that down. And that's kind of the gist of 2 paragraphs of the many 10 paragraphs, and not including the liberty or death. William Wirt clearly invented the speech. He was a great orator, William Wirt. So he used his oratory and put it in the mouth of Henry. He was actually the guy who gave the official speech on the Jubilee celebration in Washington. The 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. William Wirt was the orator. I mean, he was the main orator, one of the great orators of his day. And so now we have. So it's simply not true in the sense that he didn't make that speech. But here's the kernel of truth. The kernel of truth is that Henry was politically a warmonger, and he was really pushing for militarization, and so for preparation, for mobilization. And so that's what the speech was about. And the kernel of truth is that several people commented on that speech and said, wow, he really, as they say today on TV, he hit the ball out of the ballpark. Well, they didn't have a ballpark then to hit it out of, but that's what they were saying. And so the kernel of truth is that it's a very dramatic appeal to a call to arms, and a very dramatic one. The term liberty or death, he might have said that because, for instance, we know Christopher Gadsden was saying that in Latin 10 years earlier, and he was a radical from Charleston, South Carolina. It was in the vernacular. And why wouldn't he say? He might have said it. He might not have said it. But so there's a kernel of truth. But the idea that that was his speech is literally not true. As such. Here's another. I'm going to give you one other example, which is just hysterical, and that's Molly Pitcher. Molly Pitcher. Okay, here's the kernel of truth. The story of Molly Pitcher is that she carried water in pitchers, literally, dinnerware, fine dinnerware she's carrying onto the battlefield supposedly, and had for the soldiers to, I guess, sip daintily, from her fine dinnerware, and then when her husband falls, she mans the cannon. Okay, so. The kernel of truth is that there were, they call them camp followers, women who joined the army. They were and they did all the laundering and the cooking and all that stuff. During battles, they schlepped water, not in fine dinnerware. They schlepped water in big wooden buckets, and and they did lots of other things, and very likely they, firing a cannon is a team effort, and if somebody fell, very likely some did helped out, and there were a couple of recollections many years later of such people doing that, but the actual creation of Molly Pitcher is a total fabrication. It started with this gal. The one known case at the time with contemporaneous evidence of a woman who took her place at her husband's cannon was Margaret Corbin, and they called her Captain Molly. And she actually, we know that she received rations after the war. She was stationed up by West Point, but they also called her Dirty Kate, and she was kind of like, she was syphilitic, and she was hardly a heroine. And then lo and behold, in the Napoleonic Wars, there's this story of this woman who carried. This is like, now we're in the early 1800s. This story of this woman who's carrying water to the soldiers and takes her place, and she's called the Maid of Saracosa. And then that story really, and then we kind of like, just right after that, suddenly this story of kind of of our own Maid of Saracosa, and she gets this name. It's not, they don't call her Captain Molly, and we're about 40 years after the fact, the name Molly Pitcher starts to come in. And then, once the legend is there, this local promoter from Carlisle, Pennsylvania says, we had a gal there at Monmouth, and her name was Mary Ludwig Hayes Macaulay, and that's the real Molly Pitcher. And then some other township somewhere else said, no, ours is. But anyway, and now we're actually almost the center. We're in the 1860s when these promoters are trying to do their thing, and basically they succeed. And like in the American National Biography, I can't remember which version of it, the 1999 and whatever, but there you see Mary Ludwig Hayes Macaulay, Molly Pitcher, a.k.a. Molly Pitcher. It's just hysterical. The genesis of the folklore is what I'm saying. How we tell the story, to dissect the story and see how it emerges from the kernel of truth is, yes, there were camp followers, and they hauled water in buckets, and they fired cannons, and that is the kernel of truth. It's a great kernel of truth, and the romanticized story is purely fiction.
We're talking to Ray Raphael of RayRaphael.com, the author of Founding Myths. And Ray, when we're taught the causes of the revolution, the main cause seems to vary dependent upon the instructor teaching the lesson, like so many other things do in class. There are textbook issues like freedom and, of course, the fight against tyranny, and then there are those, let's call them skeptical historians, who have pointed at the great land grab that was desired by Washington, or at Hancock's need to control markets, or even a more generic fight against mercantilism, which really limited colonial profits. So I want to ask you, what was the main reason we moved towards revolution?
Once again, it's all about alliances, and there is no we. There's no there. There's no one version. All people had all sorts of motivations for independence, and also you have to say, like, anytime people wanted to be independent, when? What point? Are we talking 1776? 1766, they say Samuel Adams wanted to be independent. Totally bogus. There was an accusation by a Tory trying to discredit him because Adams was a very great political kind of operative, very powerful operative. He wasn't a rabble-rouser, he was an operative. He was very, very successful. He's very good at his work. So they tried to discredit him, saying, "Oh, he's trying for independence," and everybody, no. Anyway, it was so outrageous that that charge wasn't even taken seriously in Britain. That's in the 1760s. That's taxation without representation. Nobody's talking independence. In 1774 is the first time they talk about it, and the reason that the people in Massachusetts are talking about it is because the Tea Party, in reaction to the Tea Party, okay, the British closed the port of Boston, that's bad enough, but worse yet, they revoke the Massachusetts Constitution. And that is the trigger. Hey, nobody can handle it. Your Constitution. They had a lot of democracy in Massachusetts. The people had a say in almost everything, and they totally just wiped it. They just wiped it clean in the Massachusetts Government Act. That's why. So the people in Massachusetts, the grassroots movement had a very gutsy reason, yes, and so they're pushing the story. Then other colonies, there's a lot of moderates who don't want to be independent. Ben Franklin says, "Oh, we should pay for the Tea Party." So we don't. A lot of people trying to avoid the conflict. So the people of Massachusetts have their version. Once there's military conflict, people have all other reasons for independence. Certainly, westward expansion is a huge situation. That was one of the main complaints in the 60s, was the closing of the demarcation line on the Allegheny Mountains, the forbidding of settlers in the West, and so certainly land developers and and people who want to move west, people who want to make money moving west. For instance, Washington was one of them, the Ohio Company and all that. They have their reasons for doing it. Washington, gosh, his reasons were amazing. You should read them. In my founder's book, he had a lot of personal reasons for moving west, for doing that. A lot of them having to do of British government interfering with his westward, his claim. He got land in compensation for his participation in the French and Indian War, and they were making it very difficult. Basically, the British bureaucracy was like throwing kinks in the machinery there for getting his land. And then he also felt very insecure because he had his own kind of psychological dependence on British comforts, and that made him feel bad. So actually, once we had so he got it behind the boycott movement, and they actually, there's these great letters. They say, this is great because if we have this patriotic movement, it's going to help me wean myself of my habit, basically. So, this is just all kinds of reasons, and people joining the sides, and which side they join. So a lot of the elites have their own reasons for independence at this time, and sometimes when the elites, say in the Hudson Valley, the Whigs in the Hudson Valley, they own a lot of land, and their tenants, they don't like their landlords, and so they become, quote, Tories. They couldn't give a damn about the British king. They don't know any, they don't give a damn about that. They just know that they don't like their, the manors, the lord of the manors there. And similarly in Maryland, there's a lot of loyalists who are actually just very poor farmers who are kind of revolting against. So there's a very complex politics involved and allegiances involved. So this whole thing of Whig versus Tory and two sides. At that time, there was no America. There was just a lot of colonies and a lot of things going on in each separate colony, and there was just enough people fighting for independence on the Revolution for all their screwy different reasons, and some mesh with each other and some don't. But if they're all out there in that cause and willing to put men on the men are willing to fight, then they can stage an army and it can happen.
And happen it did. Now, regarding George Washington, the recurrent themes of the Washington taught in schools today are the ideas that he was such a great leader that his men stayed with him through the harshest of winters, such as Valley Forge, that when some supporters floated the idea of him being king, that he quickly rebuffed the idea, and that when he was chosen as the first president, there was really no other choice. He was, as they say, a man that was first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. However, that's quite a leap from the real George Washington.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the whole, first of all, he's not some great genius commander. I think Washington's true genius was that he actually understood the Republican, meaning the Republican not today and the Republican Democratic, the Republican principle, the Republican basis for which we were becoming independent. He got it, that this is not a top-down affair all the way. And he, for instance, he complained bitterly about Congress's inability to equip the Army, but he never sort of tried to usurp power from Congress. He never did that, and he didn't because he kind of got it what was happening. He had to be talked out of numerous bad calls. He wanted to invade Boston. They would have been skunked. He wanted to invade New York, from the outside of New York. They didn't have a prayer. His generals talked him out of it, And so he actually, I think his genius is that he listened, actually, but it's the same thing, like in sports today, one great, well, of course, LeBron James, that's another matter, but still, I mean, even he doesn't do everything. So the story is always more complex than that. And in Washington, it's not like the country wanted to make him king. There was a huge, when the Society of the Cincinnatists came, basically the officers, and people are worried that they're going to want to make Washington king, and huge popular resentment to that. And so Washington, when he resigns, that was a good thing to resign, but that he had his ear to the ground. I mean, it would not have been a universal, rallying point had he not done that.
Well, my favorite aspect of Washington's presidency was his farewell address when he warns us against entangling alliances and political parties. Great advice.
It is great advice, but the backstory there, though, to contextualize it, because I've done a lot of work on the Constitution and implementing the Constitution, and I wrote a book on the presidency and how Washington, the creation of the president, it's called Mr. President, and how Washington strengthened the presidency. And in his farewell address, the Republican ideal was that people get together and elect the wisest people, their representatives, and then the people shut up about it and let the representatives govern. And 2 years later for Congress, and 4 years later for president, and 6 years later for Senate, the people can give a yay or nay. Do you like that guy or not? But the actual process of governing should be done by the people who know how to govern. And so what was forming in resistance to some of the Hamiltonian Federalist policies was an opposition group. They called themselves Democratic Republican societies. And what he's calling about the absence of party and everything, what he's doing, he's dissing those Democratic Republican societies, and actually calls them by name, and says, "Hey, you guys are, this is not your business to do that." He didn't want popular involvement in the act of governing. It's not like he wanted to disenfranchise people. He said there's two steps: representative government, in which you let the reps do their thing, and democratic government, which none of those prominent founding fathers were for direct involvement of the people.
Ray, we always see these presidential performance surveys among historians, and they used to be somewhat rare, and gosh, now it seems like they're out every 5 years. But the lowest I've ever seen Washington ranked is third. So what do you think about those polls, as well as the ranking of Washington as a top 3 president?
I'm a non-participant. I do not participate in such rankings. To me, that's another simplest way of oversimplifying history, and I can't go there. I mean, it's very similar to the one man thing. I mean, as a matter of fact, I think it's really anti-historical to do that, because basically you're comparing apples with oranges. There's no way you can say what you're facing in this, all the components of this situation are comparable to all the components of this other situation. So no, I just don't go there. I think it's kind of a parlor game is what I do, and it's sort of a way. And I've confronted with this. I mean, I have a whole chapter in my Founding Myths about these people who say, who's the greatest president, and then one historian says, oh, it's got to be Adams because he had the hardest lot, because everybody was against him. He was a solo fighter or something like that. But I mean, this stuff, it's just, anything needs to be more broadly contextualized than that simple ranking system.
Well, I think those kinds of surveys really speak to our need of a hierarchy where everyone has their spot, and we like knowing who's the top or who's the greatest, and we like knowing the bottom or the worst. Rankings do matter in America, but you're right, they are completely devoid of context. Now, you mentioned Alexander Hamilton earlier, and And I have to ask, I'm wondering what you think of this movement that has really resurrected the interest in Hamilton. The Broadway musical is an incredible success. The album is owned by an amazing amount of high school and college kids, and it's really brought Hamilton back into the historical discussion. So what do you think about Hamilton as this pop culture icon, and what should these same kids really know about him?
Well, yeah. Well, I'm pretty well versed in this because actually, I've been paying attention, and then about a year after the play opened, Barnes & Noble asked me to write a short biography of Hamilton because, not everybody wanted to read Chernow. So my wife and I did that, and we were hoping that would include tickets, but actually, so we asked the editor, I said, hey, we get tickets? He says, no, I'm trying to get it myself. So as it turns out, the irony is, as it turns out, we actually we saw the play the day after pub date for the book. The day after the book came out. It's just called Hamilton, and it's through Barnes and Noble. They wanted their own book. But anyway, so we did the whole thing, and I love the play. The play is amazing. You can't even the score is amazing, and the lyrics and everything. But to see it too, try to do it when it comes to your town. It's a tricky one because I'm pretty, I'm kind of a stickler for most of us historians are sticklers, but I'm less grumpy than other people are because there's so much that they really did capture a lot of stuff, and the play is not idolizing Hamilton in any way. They get into but what I get a kick out of, and the reason I was really excited to write the book and be part of it, is the way the story for over 2 centuries, and Hamilton has been the man, the inside man, the man on the inside, the man at the top. He's signified, and politically, it was Hamiltonian policies that Washington kind of. Hamilton shaped the Washington administration. And then we write a lot about that alliance they had, and that it was really Hamilton who created the two parties because his policies, the other party was created in opposition to his policies, and so he's always been seen as kind of that, the man at the top and the inside, and for over 2 centuries. And I remember when I started writing about the American Revolution and going to history conferences, and one of the historians says, "Well, tell me, are you a Hamiltonian or a Jeffersonian?" As if those are still the two camps, right? And so what I get a kick out of is it took this Lin-Manuel of Puerto Rican descent to suddenly flip the story on its head and see Hamilton as the outsider instead of the insider. And of course but as you see the play, it's the outsider who becomes the insider. And it's just a hysterical tale. And Aaron Burr in the play is always complaining he wants to be in the room where it happens, in the room where it happens, in the room where it happens. And Hamilton is the penultimate guy who's in the room where it happens. So anyway, I think the play as a historical phenomenon in its own right it's amazing, and that it comes out now. And I think it's pretty cool, and hopefully people would then look at the whole thing and get into the history. When my wife and I saw it and looked around in the audience, we were very happy to have written the book about it, realizing that very few people in that audience probably really got the historical context. And my hope is that people will be stimulated to get the historical context, and my worry is that they will basically simplify history and talk about Hamiltonians and Jeffersonians, and that's the end of it.
Ray, you were a contemporary of Howard Zinn, the author of A People's History of the United States, and that book may be the most widely used non-textbook in high school and college history classes today. What's the importance of both Zinn and his People's History?
Basically, it's let's see, that's a long story with Howard Zinn. Actually, I first encountered Howard I'm going to go back to our common roots, which was the civil rights movement. Howard was very active in the civil rights movement. He actually taught college down in one of the black schools. I can't remember which one. And so he was a prominent figure there, and he wrote the first book about it. It's called SNCC, The New Abolitionists. And that was the first work I've ever read of his. So he, very much like myself, but more prominently than myself, actually internalized that and came up with, basically, his is truly, it's not only the history of common people, it's the history of protest. It's the history of struggles, more of class struggles and the class pacifists, the people who are really resisting the dominant narrative, and in many cases that has racial overtones and economic overtones. And I was teaching high school, and I used people's history in the United States. But at that point, I was teaching kind of in an alternative setting, and I had to teach that along with regular history in order to get some kind of stereoscopic vision. Because the truth is, like Howard, like myself, is basically a bottom-up historian. But the deeper I got into history, I said, you can't just be a bottom-up historian, any more than you can be a top-down historian like Joseph Ellis and these guys who just say it all happens in the room where it happens, and that's the end of history, right? History happens on the interface between bottom-up and top-down. Power goes up and down these hierarchies, and that's the dynamic process that history is all about. Is the interplay between the social movements and the people, everyday people on the outside, and those on the inside who must, in a society such as ours, who must respond to those social movements, and how they respond, whether they incorporate them or repress them, and then the people who get in powerful positions because of those social movements. For instance, Donald Trump, he's in that position because of a very prominent, alt-right social movement. And so once he's up there, there's all kinds of stuff happening in the room where it happens now. But the interface between that and his base and the progressive base and all that stuff, that's where history is happening, on those interfaces.
As a historian who's found a comfortable place at that point between bottom-up and top-down history, and as someone who teaches and writes about the alternative to the establishment, I'm wondering about your views on conspiracy theory. Now, it seems like you were directly affected by those horrible political assassinations of the 1960s, and they're rife with conspiracy. Yet you've also been open to alternative theories, and it seems like conspiracy is bottom-up. And what I mean by that is that conspiracy researchers are usually in defense of either the average person or someone who has been wronged, like, say, Lee Harvey Oswald or Sirhan Sirhan or James Earl Ray. So are you open to conspiracy?
Well, first of all, I want to talk just a little bit about conspiracy theory in general. And I think it's very hard. Conspiracy theories are very hard to analyze precisely because they're about conspiracies, and whether those conspiracies exist. I mean, by the very nature of these conspiracies, they're secret. And so how do you determine? But there's one rule of thumb that I use to whether the conspiracy theory even gets a seat at the table of something worth entertaining. And that is, you look at the narrative that it's creating. How complex a conspiracy is it in terms of, in particular, how many people must be involved in the cover-up? Now, for instance, this chemtrail, that's a conspiracy theory, right? Chemtrails.
Right, yes.
Now, if you start asking somebody, now, how many people do you think are involved? Who's involved in this? Now, there's the people who hatch it up. There's got to be a lot of pilots up there doing their thing. There's got to be a lot of infrastructure people creating all these things. And so there's got to be, all sorts of people from all over the place involved. And the notion that all these people are doing this for some, and all sharing this kind of like diabolical scheme, and not one whistleblower has ever come out, that's what I don't get. Now, on the other hand, let's take the James Earl Ray conspiracy, okay, theory. Now, how many people would have to be involved in that, in him being the setup for that? I can see that there's a dozen people, maybe. You know what I mean? It's like it. And I'm not saying that the theorists are that theory is right or wrong. But I'm saying when you get it down to that kind of level, or the FDR, what did he know, and you have really just this handful of people who could make that happen, then at least there is a seat at the table for it. Then you can. The problem is, by its very nature, it's secret, and how the heck do you document it? Number one, that's one problem. Number two is that I worry about the impact of conspiracy theories in terms of just this whole thing about fake news. And as a historian, it's like the philosopher Wittgenstein said, "Whereof one cannot speak, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one cannot know." It's like you can't. If there's no way of ascertaining this, it's hard to know where to go with that. I mean, then you're just talking about two belief systems. And then you're just talking, my God is better than your God, or my God is more accurate than your God. I mean, so as a historian who values evidence, I just kind of like don't go places where I can't really find evidence.
Right, I understand.
But that said, I think that I'm just on the positive side of something like the James Hill, that conspiracy, or even the Kennedy assassination theory. It's a good thing that people question. Yeah, it's a good thing that people question the dominant narrative.
Well, as someone who generally believes in conspiracy, I can say that one of the most troubling responses to conspiracy, for me at least, is when the anti-conspiracy party says, well, if that many people knew, somebody would have talked. But when people do talk, and in the JFK assassination case, for example, that number is in the 3 digits now. The mainstream media just writes them off. So, as you said, it's then a battle of strident beliefs. And sure, without more evidence, it's difficult to resolve older conspiracies like the Lincoln assassination or the Knights of the Golden Circle. But with more modern conspiracies, with JFK, with RFK, with Watergate, with Iran-Contra, I don't know if we've heard the final take yet.
I don't know if you'll ever hear the final take on such things, And once again, at that point, I'm going to have to bow out because I haven't. Precisely because evidence is so difficult, I find that I just don't go there. I was going there as a participant in the JFK business. I mean, I was very active in this, as I say, the civil rights. Anyway, that. We certainly delved deeply into that JFK situation and conspiracy at that time. But there's, I just don't know how far to take this conversation. It has to be it has to be case by case. But I do think that it's interesting that one problem that I have with conspiracy theories is that some people seem to embrace them all. And what's going on there? And to me, that's seen as a bottom-up kind of approach. You mentioned it, but I'm wondering if it's actually a top-down thing, where you're thinking that everything is engineered in back rooms from the top down and from the inside out, and all those conspiracies, as opposed to just things happening to some extent. Anyway, that's something to think of.
Oh, I think that's a valid argument. It is case by case, and as you alluded to earlier, we should always question even if we don't always believe. So 2018 is the 50th anniversary of the RFK assassination in Los Angeles, and I was wondering if you were an RFK guy in 1968.
No, at the time, I'm going to put you back there. Let's see, I'm 25 years old, and I've been in the movement since I was 18, so I'd already been in the movement since 1961, 62, whatever that is. And we, at that point, it's interesting, now I'm 75, and I have sort of a different view, but I was definitely on the progressive end of things, and as I said, involved in SNCC and radical peace organizations. Never went nearly so far as the Weathermen. That was 68 was a strange time where the radicalization of the movement kind of imploded into that. But we progressives, we were way into Eugene McCarthy. Eugene McCarthy was the peace candidate, and he was very popular on college campuses, and he was the progressive man. He was kind of the Bernie Sanders, and he had all of our allegiance. And when RFK, who had been flirting with getting into the movement or not, and then he only did it when he saw McCarthy's support, and he thought maybe I actually could win. We were kind of suspicious of that, because he wasn't quite radical enough for us. So we weren't. Anyway, I personally had a different take on the conspiracy because I wasn't like a worshiper of. I mean, on the assassination. That said, historically, it was immense. Very historically significant, because it is very possible that Kennedy would have been president. Yeah, and I think not only possible, but I think it was likely. I mean, once again, now I'm out of my league, there's no evidence, so I shouldn't be talking. Hey, but here's the funny thing, we're talking like we're historians and abstract and everything, but we're also people, I got my beliefs, if he would have been president, and then I have this other thing about how history happens, who was that guy, Julian Gonzalez, he washed ashore from Cuba, a 6-year-old kid, and do you remember that in this 1990s?
I think it was Elian Gonzalez.
Elian, yeah, that's right, Elian Gonzalez, and he washed ashore in the 60s, and then this little kid washes ashore, and then Janet Reno, Clinton's Attorney General, wants to ship him back, and or something like that, and all the Cuban exiles get absolutely furious and turn totally anti-Clinton, anti-democratic, okay, in Florida. Then comes the 2000 elections and the hanging Chad and the loss by 500 votes. Clearly, more than 500, Cuban exiles, were that vote would have been different. Because of not only changing votes, but the energy of the anti-Clinton mood in Florida. And so this little 6-year-old kid washing ashore, and then we'd have had that not happened, we would probably not have had the Iraq War, And so I start wondering about that, and what that, the consequences of history, and then I have to think back to my daddy. My daddy always used to say, if my Aunt Matilda had wheels, she'd be a trolley car.
Ray, that's great. What a funny guy he must have been.
Yeah.
So Ray Raphael, if people want to find you or follow you online, how can they go about doing so?
Well, the basic place, the easiest access place is go to rayraphael.com, and Raphael is spelled R-A-P-H-A-E-L, like the archangel or the painter or the Ninja Turtle. So rayraphael.com, or if you just do and then I have a website that's generally 6 months behind or something. But anyway, and there you'll see my recent works, and you'll go to the book. The book page, book list has all 20 books. Most recently, I think, for people to maybe pay attention to now, is I did an annotation of the Constitution. It's called the U.S. Constitution Explained Clause by Clause for Every American Today. And a lot of my recent work has been on the Constitution, and clearly the Constitution is a big deal now. So anyway, and it's a very handy. My publisher wanted me to do that. My Vintage, part of Random House Penguin. They wanted me to do that because the existing annotations are either right-wing nut jobs all about the law of Moses or school book dry. And so this one is accessible and right there and, fits in your vest pocket. And it's explained clause by clause for every American today. The different, basically I translate Constitutionese into the modern idiom.
And we will have a link to your site and work on MidnightWriterNews.com. I can't recommend it highly enough, folks. Ray is a great writer and his work is valuable. Go online, make a purchase. You will not regret it. And Ray, I can't thank you enough. Founding Myths is still one of my favorite works, and this has truly been an honor. Thank you so much.
Well, it's been a delightful conversation. You came up with some phrases that I can't wait to get the recording and write down your phrases. Don't worry, I will credit you.
Ray, are you kidding me? They're all yours.
Okay, great. Very fun talking with you. Very good.
And this has been Ray Raphael. I'm St. Patrick. This is the Midnight Rider News Show, and we'll be right back.
Hi, this is Ray Locker, the author of Nixon's Gamble. For more on how President Nixon's own secret government destroyed his administration, listen to episode 37 of the Midnight Rider News Show.
Tonight, Ray Raphael and I discussed the teaching of history quite a bit, and thank you for allowing us to engage in a little shop talk. I enjoyed it. But since this show is about history, the teaching of that history is a valid topic of discussion. The history or social studies department of a high school or college deals with the issue of bias more than any other department, with apologies to the science departments out there who also deal with it pretty regularly. But history teachers deal with it every single day. At my last school, we had a parents' night the night before school began, and inevitably, and with a pretty critical eye, a parent would always ask me why I was using A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn as one of the multiple texts. Now, conservative parents would look at me as if I just flown in from Berkeley, and liberal parents questioned the Ron Paul campaign poster that I had on the wall. So at some point, what can you do? Now, what they failed to realize was that instructional bias in American history has nothing to do with conservative versus liberal. Ray touched on the idea of how we teach stories. What do we teach about Washington's character or Jefferson's genius, for example? We talked about both this evening. So to illustrate this, I use the example of Truman's decision to drop an atomic bomb on Hiroshima and then Nagasaki. Now, this isn't about left versus right. This is about establishment versus alternative. The historical establishment would demand that you teach it in a way that pits Truman's decision to drop the bombs against a decision to not drop the bombs. And that's it. That's what you teach. That's what every junior high or high school history instructor has taught across the country. You have the students make 2 columns, and you put the arguments against both or for both in each column. Or you do 4 columns, and you do the pros and cons of each side, to drop the bomb or not to drop the bomb. That would be the question. The alternative, however, and the way that I taught it, was to look at atomic weaponry and to discuss whether or not the United States or any country should have created such a weapon to begin with. We take a step back and discuss how we got there rather than solely debating what we do when we are there. We should be questioning those things that are assumed, not only those things that are established historical arguments. Let me read you one of the Sunshine State standards by which Florida teachers must abide, and this is Rule 5F, or Standard 5F. Quote, "The student understands the political events that shaped the development of United States foreign policy since World War II and knows the characteristics of that policy." That's it. That's the entirety of foreign policy since World War II. If you think states are telling teachers what they have to teach word for word, they aren't. That standard is about as broad and general as it can be made, and I like them that way. It gives the professional, the educator, the leeway to teach what they know, and that's what they should be able to do. But this is where real bias comes in. Now, for my 10 years in the field, I discovered that the biggest bias isn't political at all. The largest bias I dealt with, and the one about which I even argued with myself constantly, was all about coverage. What do we cover and how much? Now, there's so much history, almost anything can be left out, right? What will you drop from your own curriculum to teach the Hollywood blacklist, for example? What about spending an extra day or 2 on Watergate? How deeply do you want to go into the biography and psychology of, say, Andrew Jackson? What about the rise of Mormonism? Will you sacrifice a day on FDR to teach more RFK? Or do you cover them all? And if so, how much? Remember, though, if you add something, you must take away something else. And you have 36 weeks to tell the story of America. Now, imagine being a world history teacher. Again, 36 weeks, the history of the world. It is hard. Believe me, the toughest choices you'll make all year are made before class even begins. And then you have to field all the questions from the community asking why you didn't cover this person or that battle or that debate or that issue because I think it's very important. And it probably is, but I always responded with, if I cover that or that person or that battle or that issue, what do you suggest we take away? That usually ended up with I'm just saying it's important. And I agree with you. It is important. But what can we take away? So that being said, I loved teaching history. My students were incredible. My colleagues taught me so much, and I love that field. So why did I leave? I didn't. Longtime listeners of this show know that my goal, above all, is to educate. That's what I want this show to do. Challenge the historical establishment and the textbook conglomerates that attempt to make those content decisions for us. That's what we do. And educate in the best way possible. That's what I hope that you get from us. And that's what I hope that you get from the show. And that's what I hope what you got from Ray Raphael tonight. And that's, I can promise you, what we'll continue to do. Thank you once again for being part of our global classroom here at Midnight Rider News. And from the other side of the mountain, on the best side of midnight, I wish you peace.
I welcome this kind of examination.
I am paying for this microphone.
What difference does it make?
I'm as mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore.
I'm just a patsy.
Not a Pax Americana, enforced on the world by American weapons of war.
Wherever there's a cop beating up a guy, I'll be there.
We didn't land on Plymouth Rock. The rock was landed on us.
The United States is owned by foreign corporations. Do you really care? And if anybody cares, they're considered crazy.
I have sinned against you, my Lord.
Man, all the humanity and all
the controllers here looking very carefully at the situation. Obviously a major malfunction.
An unspeakable tragedy. Dead on arrival.
And I will go to my grave being at peace about it.
Our long national nightmare is over. Don't give up. Don't ever give up.
This is the Midnight Rider News Show with S.T. Patrick.